All right, thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, and collaborate on pressing issues of the day. Today's On the Park Bench webinar is The Magic of Inner Block Development, Alleyways as the Final Frontier of New Urbanism, with Thomas Dougherty and Aaron Lubeck. If you are interested and want to share your thoughts, you can go to tinyurl.com/OTPBfeedback to give ideas for On the Park Bench. We also have another webinar this month. It will be on Tuesday, September 20th, and will feature Project for Code Reform in Wisconsin. Resources on that will be available at cnu.org/resources/ontheparkbench. And now for today's webinar. We are joined by Aaron Lubeck, who is a new urban builder in Durham, North Carolina, and founder of Southern Urbanism, a nonprofit committed to city building in the South. He is the author of a children's book on accessory dwellings entitled Heather Has Two Dwellings, and host of the National Town Builder Association's Town Builders podcast. Thomas Dougherty holds a Master of Architecture and Master of Urban Design from the University of Notre Dame. He is author of The American Alley, a hidden resource published by Strong Towns, and works as a UX urban designer, designing and advocating for interblock urban spaces. And I'm Lauren Mayer, Communications Manager at CNU. The topic of today's webinar is interblock development. Interblock development is a distinct urban type that includes buildings on alleys, mews, pedestrian paths, in cottage courts, and more, to introduce intimacy and safety to urbanism at all scales. Today's panelists have made a special study of this urban type. The webinar will start with a brief presentation, followed by an interview between Aaron and Thomas. They are hoping for an active conversation with you, the audience, so please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur. All right, now over to you.
Aaron, you're muted.
Thinking that you're leading here, Thomas. So my name is Aaron Lubeck, as introduced by them. I'm actually going to lead the chat later, but mostly we'll start with a presentation by Thomas, who, as you mentioned, we'll talk a little bit more about his book, where a lot of these images come from. The American Alley, which is, I highly recommend everybody in this call pick up. Just beautiful drawings, and really kind of the only book out there on this topic. Not only the history of alleys, but also the kind of the dimensional rules to follow, how these things work, and why great space is formed by tight-knit building. So I'm going to let Thomas lead on this, and then I will come back for commentary when he's done.
Thanks, Aaron. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I'm going to give the brief overview that Lauren just gave. The plan for this hour is I'm going to give a brief presentation, 10 minutes. I'm going to talk about the inner block as an urban type, its characteristics, its implications for form-based codes, and the future of alleys. Then Aaron will moderate a conversation for 15, 20 minutes, but we're really hoping to save that final 20, 25 minutes for open Q&A. So write down your questions or put them into the chat thingy. So I'm going to start with this. If I can get my screen to go. Which is the most photographed street in the United States? Well, if you type that into Google, you're going to get Acorn Street. Right, Beacon Hill is great. Here's the street network of Beacon Hill. So where's Acorn Street, the most photographed street in the United States? You know, the question is this even a street, right? We're looking at something, you know, one of these things is not like the others. Acorn Street right here is at a scale, a width, a length that is unlike the rest of Beacon Hill in Boston. It's 18 to 21 feet wide. Along one whole wall, one whole side of the street is a garden wall. It's non-continuous, and the other side of the street is formed by brick party wall row homes. So looking at it, you might say, well, that looks like an alley. Well, it's also the most photographed street, according to Google, of the United States. If you keep going down that road of like, okay, well, what's the second most photographed street, or what's in the top 10, you're going to start seeing the minor streets in Philadelphia. You're going to see Alfred's Alley and other minor streets. So this is the intersection of Irving and Quint streets. And I'm just going to point out the figure ground right here, right? This is the major street network of Philadelphia. These are the planned streets. And these are all the little unplanned streets that were built by the incremental developers of 1800, right? So I happen to know that these two houses right here were built by the incremental developer, Henry Vollum, in 1813. 18 to 21 foot wide, non-continuous, right? This is not part of the rest of the grid. Brick party wall row homes. So this is definitely in the top, let's say 10 most photographed streets. We can keep playing this game all day. So what's the most Instagrammable street in Edinburgh? Go ahead and Google it. You're probably going to come up with Circus Lane in Edinburgh. Again, note, this is 18 feet wide from wall to wall, little 2-story party wall residential buildings. This is the magic of inner block development. Today, I want to introduce the inner block as a place where your town and city's most beautiful human-scaled urbanism is waiting to be built. Humans are hardwired for human scale. And this is something we generally stopped building, human scale, about 200 years ago. And I would argue that once you're inside of the block, once you're inside of any Acorn Street, Irving Street, Circus Lane, you're at a scale where that development takes up all of your experience. And in some sense, you could be anywhere. It creates such a strong sense of place. The sense of place at 18 to 22 feet wide is extremely powerful. So what is inner block urbanism? Well, one insight is this observation by Douglas Duwani. And I guess I'd say it's not really a directive, it really was an observation. And he said, inside the city block, you find the intimacy of the hamlet, the quietness and sense of safety that could bring families with children into the city. And if you see this right here, right, this is in Bruges in Belgium, and it's just a very clear example of an inner block space and inner block development. Here we have our block. You can see the street come. Here's the street. Here's the street. This little collection of 14 homes around a garden is accessed via that urban gateway, that gateway into the center of the block. This is inner block. So what are the characteristics of inner block? You know, this is a really clear example, but there are other examples that are probably less clear. What about Acorn Street and some of these other? And that's what I want to cover in the rest of this presentation. And so the three that I'm going to call out today are nested, right? It's inside of the block, human scale, and transect shift. So down the path of nested. This is the block and street pattern of the historic city center of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And I've highlighted right here, you know, this little stretch of street. It's 24 foot wide from building face to building face, right? So this is the block and street pattern of Utrecht. It's very clear in that figure ground. Unless you were looking for it, you wouldn't see all of these other inner block public spaces. And there's a sense kind of like semi-public, semi-private. You know, you might not walk down that street or through that passage or through that opening because you don't know if you're really allowed to. And I'm going to go back to this one, for example. I would not have gone through this if a professor had not been walking myself and other grad students through Bruges and saying, let's go through there. And just for fun, let's look at the intersection of these two streets. So this is our 24 foot from building face to building face street. And here's our 12 foot wide inner block, Minor Street, and that's the intersection. So I'm walking down this street and I look to the left. That is the passage entrance to get over to here. So that's a version of inner block of infill development in a traditional historic city. Well, here's another characteristic of inner block spaces: human scale. Humans are hardwired for human scale. This is Carlton Landing in Oklahoma, and this is an example of inner block, that a place with those characteristics of nested, human scale, transect shift, and new greenfield development. And I want to highlight that sense of place. This is from the lexicon of the new urbanists. Sense of place, a highly desirable but elusive attribute of urbanism. Its existence is notoriously unpredictable in conventional suburban design, but common in traditional urban fabric. There's a very strong tie between that sense of place and human scale. I really like going to Carlton Landing. I've been there multiple times, many times. I think there are lots of strong pieces to that urban design. If you were to walk around here, just look at the scale right from the aerial, right? You have this little space right here, which is 18 feet wide. And you have all of these other places. When I think about sense of place, I think about Carlton Landing maybe as a neighborhood as a whole, and different images come to mind. But then there are key places within Carlton Landing which jump out. And this is top of the list. And Clay Chapman didn't build this, but he designed it. And I asked him, I said, Clay, what were you looking to for precedent? He said, well, there's this street up in Boston called Acorn Street. So he was taking the measurement. He designed the dimensions of this, the scale of this from Acorn Street. And going further down that lane, right? So we were right here, now we're walking down here. Look at the human scale that's been captured here. Think about, we all know Carlton Landing. Most of us know Carlton Landing, at least images from Carlton Landing. These are the images that we know because these are the most powerful images of space, of sense of place, human scale. So finally, transect shift, this characteristic of inner block. And I've gone back to Circus Lane here, which I showed at the beginning. And I'm just kind of walking us down the main street here and then into the lane here. So this is our first image 1, and we're looking at 75 to 95 feet to the cornice height and 100 feet from building face to building face, which that's actually narrower than building face to building face of my street, which I'm looking at right here. So then you keep going down and you look to your left, and it's startling. You go from city to village, just like bam, right there. And that, I think very often we look at the transect and it's this gradation. And you go from city to rural. Douglas, who helped pioneer this term, would say, hey, we got the transect wrong when we did that. We have to recognize that the transect is nested, right? You end up with village inside city block. You end up with hamlet inside of other block, collections of blocks. So you can go from, T5 to hamlet just by going inside the block. So we look to the left, here's that village street. You walk another 10 seconds down that street, and all of a sudden it's 18 to 22 feet to cornice height and 18 feet from building face to building face. Okay, inner block and form-based codes. I'm prejudiced, but I think South Bend is one of the most exciting places in new urbanism right now. In 2021, they won the Richard H. Driehaus Award for their new form-based code, and the new pre-approved building plans that I think Jen Griffin helped put together is the pre-approved plans by Matt Petty and Matt Hoffman. That's the future of zoning and urbanism, new urbanism, I'm confident. And I think South Bend is one of the leaders in that. So we looked in Philadelphia and we saw the infill development, the inner block infill development of 1800. We saw what is inner block and seems to be infill. I'm sure it was platted all at the same time. but it has the sense of infill, that interblock space that's greenfield, right? And this is present day. What do we do with South Bend? What happens with form-based codes and interblock development? This past February, a former professor at Notre Dame asked me to come and spend a couple days with his students who were working on a studio project in South Bend. And the site was this block and this land here, and there's a church here, a school, and a church here. And these are the standard form-based code rules for that zone, for the NC neighborhood center district. And this is all credit to the students here. They did, I think, a remarkable job of looking at this site and creating places that human places that had never really lived in South Bend, that had never appeared in South Bend. So this is kind of the starting point, right? This is the land. And their first move was to contain the outside of the block, which is the purpose of the form-based code, right? The form-based code is reflecting the public realm. How are we shaping our streets? But then they added this narrow lane, and we're getting to that scale that we saw on Acorn Street. Like, this is not like the rest of them. This is this non-continuous 18-foot wide. Here's a plaza. And then they kept going. Look at this next phase. And I would argue, taking a page out of Opticos's book, just as there are missing middle housing types, there are missing urban spatial types that we really never got in the United States. So if you're going to Italy, you got the piazza, the piazzetta, the courtyard. Well, our urbanism really comes from England and the Netherlands. So if you go to England, you find the square, the residential mews, the residential court. In the Netherlands, you would find the Hofja or the interblock green. In historic American cities like Charleston and Philadelphia, you find the residential lane and alley. But we really lost those, and you only see little fragments in the historic cities. And so these students were bringing these missing urban spatial types to South Bend for really the first time in the history of that place. These interblock, the sense of place is so strong here. And this is their design in video, and I'm going to play this for you real quick. So this is the site, the two churches. That sense of scale, that place, that does not currently exist. Nothing like this exists in South Bend. Nested, human scale. All of this inside of the block. Look at the use of the wall, like Acorn Street. We don't use walls enough. And none of this would have been allowed via the form-based code. These moments are possible when a tree or a plant has that much sense of place. It's only possible, or that effect on the place, when you're bringing that scale down, that human scale that's so hard to come by today. This is the magic that can be created inside of a block. Okay, so this is not really, I don't have an answer to that, actually, that the question of form-based code and interblock. I would love to work with people on that answer, but I would say right now, the interblock is a huge missed opportunity for most form-based codes that are being passed. And you could say, well, hey, some of the, types that we're allowing, well, let's say one, the cottage court, that creates new public realm, because really interblock, we're adding public realm to our existing towns and cities. And so the cottage court is a version in which, yes, I can create that moment, that lovely moment of public realm there. But there are these other missing urban spatial types the students designed around that we're not taking advantage of. So I'm going to talk about the alley real quick. And this is the book that Strong Towns, that I wrote in Strong Towns, published last year. And so I encourage you all to get it. It's free, downloadable online. Back to Philly real quick. So why do we have missing urban spatial types? And it's really, they didn't make it into the modern conception of a city in 1682. Philadelphia is laid out in 1682 by William Penn. And the official, so in this map right here, the official William Penn streets are in yellow, and all the incremental developer streets that were later added, those are in red. And there was no room for those red streets in the modern conception, the modern of 1700, of what the modern city should look like. And so this, on the left, these are the planned streets, and they're lovely, right? But on the right, we have the unplanned incremental developer versions of 1800, 1700, and 1800. And the cutting edge streets of 1700, the ones on the left, were meant to avoid fire, disease by having lots of light and air, and all the carriages and needs, infrastructural needs of, the industrial world. And since the old world of Europe was narrow, the thing that everybody wanted was the wide streets. So we ended up coming to the United States from the very beginning and creating wide streets. Go to your, I think very often we think, oh, well, if we were to go back to historic American towns and cities, we'd find, the human scaled, pedestrian scaled places. And that's actually rarely the case. This is this is my street right outside my window right here. It was developed far before automobiles. And yet there's 2 lanes of parking and 2 lanes of travel on my street, plus big setbacks. And that was standard, right? So the modern city wanted to have wide streets. Then Thomas Jefferson wanted to settle America. Well, the founding fathers wanted to settle America, and they wanted to do it fast. And so we got the continental grid. And so we went from meridian to parallel to check. So meridian, parallel to check to township, section. I'm getting these confused. Let's start over. Meridian, parallel, check, township, section, city block, right? And so kind of with one act, they settled all of the rest of the United States to follow this continental grid. But if you look closely, we have one right of way that's still human scaled, right there in the center. That's the alley. And so this is an alley next to the minor street of Philadelphia, drawn at the same scale. And this is the final image in my slide deck. And I just like to think of the block, the modern block, the block that we have today in the United States, and think about it similarly to the Barcelona block, turning that block inside out. Modern infrastructure needs wide streets. The first responders need wide streets. Amazon delivery, general traffic, your off-street parking, all need our existing wide streets. But there's room inside your block for an urban oasis. The most photographed street in your town or city is waiting to be built. Thank you.
That's great, Thomas. Thank you so much. So I know we've got a really well-attended park bench today, and I want to ask you a couple questions, but then really open it up. Some people have already put some great questions in the chat, which I think some of which you started to answer. But this is somewhat really unique content. So I think people are attracted to it because we don't talk about the alley enough, and there's not really other books about it. In particular, all your most Google streets, I mean, the thing that stands out to me, none of them are built in the last 200 years, even though we all love this stuff. I mean, if you remember the CNU, this is the kind of stuff we'd like to see. It's small. It's even kind of naturally affordable if this stuff was built today, just small, simple boxes. So why has nobody built this stuff in the last 200 years in your view?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many entangled pieces to that. And I think Nolan Gray in his new book on zoning is a key part of it. Let me talk real quick about why they stopped building it, right? About 1800, no, I'm sorry, about 1900, it was like 1890s in Philadelphia. They really started to crack down with building codes. And the intent was to stop the conditions which were conducive to disease and fire. And what was really pushing it was a really high density of these buildings. So you saw the little buildings, you said, yeah, they're kind of they're affordable they're naturally affordable or naturally attainable. They were called Trinity houses in Philadelphia. They were 3-story, but by about 1890, they were very often lived in by, let's say, 3, even 4 families. So they were very overcrowded, and building codes were being passed to eliminate their construction and also to demolish the existing buildings. So they weren't really seen as part of the future of the city, that they were where poor people lived. And we were doing our best to create safe, clean places that could exist. And the infrastructural needs of 1890 were for those for interblock spaces to serve, for cooking, for wells, for latrines, for all these things now that fit within a cavity wall. We needed the service alley to take care of. Yeah. So that's why they stopped doing it. And I would say today it's an opportunity that has really only opened up with some of the new ADU legislation, right? ARP and the others that have been pushing ADU legislation are really opening up the door to interblock development, something that was slammed shut 100 years ago.
When we talk, I want to get into AARP's leadership on this, but I know a bunch of the questions in the chat are about fire access and emergency egress access. Fire in particular comes up. So I'm sure many people on this call design, and this is the street that the fire marshal would not approve what the image you're showing here. But talk a little bit about your experience. My understanding is in American codes, when we overlay this sort of, 19th century and 18th century concepts onto the American grid and load it with American building codes, these ADUs, these accessory dwellings, can be treated from the front. And that unleashes the architect to design these beautiful spaces, because you don't actually have to design a code compliant alley or a fire truck compliant alley. And that allows you to create this human space, which is otherwise sort of been, legislated out of existence.
I think that's absolutely correct. And all I have to do is look at all the new ADU legislation. And that was a key piece of the unlocking, which the ADU ordinance were doing. It was pushing municipalities to accept that, to deal with that, and to look at where our comfort levels for dealing. And so I think most municipalities have a certain number of feet for their hose. Around here, it's 150 feet. So if I can get the hose to all parts of that building within 150 feet of wherever that hydrant or fire truck can get, then the first responder can get there. And so one could look at it. So I'm leaving up this diagram because I think this is actually going to be helpful for some of these. One could argue that today you could not have 2 consecutive, like I couldn't have a minor street here maybe and a minor street here. Now, Philadelphia has lots of examples where you do have that. But you could argue that, the infrastructure needs to access all the way around the block so that I can get the first responders in there, so I can get my trash to the outside of the block. But that's kind of the beauty of the situation we find ourselves in, is that we have cities that have been gridded from sea to shining sea with interblock space, many of them with alleys. And so we can kind of have these urban oases. We can have this checkerboard, right, of streets where you can have the pedestrian scaled streets, running parallel to, and a whole other kind of world adjacent to our infrastructure streets.
And on that note, I've been blessed with both CNU and the National Town Builders Association to tour a lot of the America's great T&Ds, traditional new urban neighborhoods, one of the things that always stood out to me is that while the best developers in the movement really get the street pretty well, pretty right, smaller, narrower, code-compliant primary streets, the alleys are still overwhelmingly afterthoughts. They hide the car, they check that box, which is a really core component. They but it's usually just a kind of utilitarian garage, small, if any, backyard, rarely, if ever, an ADU on it. You see some of them in Kentlands. But first of all, talk about that missed opportunity. And then also, do you have some favorite alleyways that you've seen in new urbanism besides Carlton Landing that you think are really great models to look at?
Yeah, so for both of those, I would look at, say, Rosemary, in Florida. And we use the word alley, and I think we often get things confused. And so when I'm using, in Philadelphia, the word meant narrow residential street lined with attainable housing. That's what alley meant, right? It was not a service street, and it had no service relationship to the major streets along it. And so then when you talk about the new urbanist alleys, right, those are back of house for the front street. And that's our word alley switched over to that, kind of at about 1800 when we started platting all of America, right? Like with the Continental Grid, and that center alley, that was the back of house of the industrial city. And we needed a lot of room for back of house. If you were to go down to Rosemary, what you would see is that the pedestrian ways, right? Maybe you call them streets, right? The fronts, let's call it front and back for now. The front is narrower than the back. So the back, where I have my infrastructure needs, where my first responders come, where I park my car, those areas need to be wider, and they are wider, and they're less attention and detail are put to them. They're the back of house. And the front of house, that's at this minor street scale. We're talking about 18, 22, 24 foot wide. And so it actually looks kind of like this, right? So go down to Rosemary and look at like, hey, where are people parking? Where are the first responders? Where are these? And so that's an example of a beautiful version of inner block or minor street that, these missing urban spatial types, that human scale, while also providing the parking, the trash, all the other things. And it's interesting to look at that weave and realize that the pedestrian, what we're looking for is pedestrian. Humans are hardwired for human scale, that actually the best is that narrower front, that Rosemary created. Exactly. Aaron, you're muted.
Sorry about that. It's a super interesting idea that basically inverting the two streets. And so, design-wise, there's nothing to prevent you from doing that. One of the most interesting examples is Village Homes, one of the earliest new urban-ish developments, which is really sort of suburban type houses, but in Davis, California, you pull up on the code compliant normal streets, but it's really the alleyway. And the houses are inverted to face the alley, which is a common walkway with lots of fruit trees and semi-private space and so forth. And so it seems like there's also opportunities to, whether accessory structures or not exist, but that idea of inverting really using the primary streets as the back was done there.
And I would like to jump in real quick and just say, before people say, hey, why are you trying to do that to our major streets? I think that this kind of transformation is applicable in many places. I also think that there are many arguments to not do it in certain places. I think it also can be a standalone project. When we deal with a new form-based code for a neighborhood or a city, it's encompassing of the entire area. I think with inner block things, it can happen moment by moment, right? You could have a form-based overlay or something like that, and you could tackle one block at a time. So one block, adjacent blocks, maybe one, it is appropriate right now to transform it. Maybe the other one is not. And the other thing I'd like to say is that most of these services, or these services in many towns and cities, are already on the front street. So if you were to go to South Bend, for example, most of the alleys that I have photographed there are gravel. They're 12 to 14 foot wide, and there are zero services on them. They don't get plowed. Trash doesn't get picked up on them. power lines sometimes run down them, sometimes don't, and water and septic are under the main streets. So we already, South Bend, for example, and many places in South Bend, it's already an area that actually has none of those services. So it's an opportunity waiting to be grasped there.
So I want to get into some of the questions here. I want to keep just as a shout to everybody. I know it's confusing. There's actually two places people are putting questions. I'm going to go through the Q&A format first, and then I think there's probably 25 questions posted already, Thomas. So we'll do some of this rapid fire. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you too was both about form-based codes and AARP. The form-based codes, which are sort of becoming a preferred reform to make these new urbanism sort of work in cities, seem to be really not talked about on the back of the spaces or alleyways at all. What are we missing there? And what are there examples, perhaps South Bend, where it's actually being incorporated into our form-based codes?
I would say the cottage court is the one example that I can think of that allows for new public realm. And so inner block, especially with our towns and cities today, is really the creation of new public space, right? So the inner block, we're talking about that inner block courtyard, the inner block lane, the inner block space that is public or semi-public. And so I think recognizing kind of like Opticos, right? We have missing middle housing types. We lost them for 50 years, we lost them. Well, in the United States, the modern city planning, the Enlightenment city planning of 1700 left human scale. It left many of our urban spatial types in Europe. They came over here by happenstance and by incremental developers of those time periods. And so I think recognizing those and trying and working those into, let's say, the pre-approved plan concepts, like here's a missing urban spatial type. It's called a lane. These are the pre-approved layouts and buildings that go along with them. And then you allow building codes and other things to be the guardrails of working that through a system. I think you're right. It hasn't happened yet, and I'm excited to work on it.
Yeah. And the last question before we get into these questions, but talk about AARP's role in smaller housing, senior housing, and your engagement with them. Just talking about accessory dwellings and concepts of developing alleyways. What catalyzing force have they been?
I mean, they seem to be the in conversations over the last 3 or 4 years. I think they're often brought up as they are one of the key leaders in the ADU movement. You know, they're giving the credentials to so many different practitioners, that are pushing this. And shout out to their leadership and the model, let's say the model codes that they're putting. I think those are super helpful. The pre-approved versions of ADUs that they've been championing. So my interaction with them has been it's been limited. It's actually been around the God's House and the elderly housing versions of interblock development. But that's something I would also like them to spend more time on. That would really be ARP, recognizing that kind of in that last graphic, there's a missing demographic, right? Like there's a demographic that falls, and we talk about this all the time, right? Falls between the cracks. Interblock spaces have been part of the lexicon of new urbanists from the very beginning. They just haven't been calling them what they are, right? So recognizing the fact that the children, the young, the old, our current public realm is not as suitable as it could be. We have opportunities to transform interblock spaces and alleys to make more suitable realms for them. And I think ARP would be one of the key people to champion in something like that.
And particularly making spaces for people at the margins, the young, the old.
That's right.
With health issues and so forth. Let me get into the questions. And again, there's a lot here, so we'll kind of run through these. Marion Gale had a great question about mature urban tree canopy. We often see minimal setbacks, narrow streets resulting in completely hardscape spaces where only small shrubs and small street trees don't provide adequate greenery and cooling in a dense urban environment. And you showed me this recently in Philadelphia, walking these streets with just tiny face-to-face spaces. But repeat kind of what your learnings were about the need for greenery in these spaces and how people screw that up.
Yeah, well, I guess what I first want to say is that Philadelphia is a great example of, if you were just to say, if I hadn't walked through Philly and some of these, well, in the Netherlands too, these 18 to 22 foot wide, and when I say wide, I'm talking building face to building face streets, I would think there's probably not enough room for a cart path that would allow a car to go through, and also mature trees. And then you walk down the Philly streets and you realize, well, that's wrong, right? Like you walk down these lovely streets that have fully mature canopies above them. And, we have, and I was just talking to our arborist of my local town recently, and he was talking about the infrastructure that needs to be put in the ground to allow for trees to be, adjacent to buildings. And we have the technology, and we just need to invest in it. So I think we absolutely can have that healthy, fully grown urban canopy on these narrow streets. One of the exciting things about 18 foot wide, 22 foot wide spaces is that a small move, right? And we saw that in some of these images from Philly in the Netherlands. You put a pot of plants out by your front door, and it has a huge effect on the street, right? That intentionality there, you're setting the stage for the individual citizen, the homeowner, to give that gift to the street that has a huge effect. If my street right now, if I were to walk out there, put a pot of plants, I would have to put a whole lot of pots of plants before it would have any effect at all in the street or be noticed by the street. And I would argue that it would be much, much less. But when we can bring that scale down, in some sense, I often feel like we're really setting the stage for that greenery, strip out the trees, take out the pots of plants, take out the ivy on the wall. And it goes from this magical, amazing place to like kind of a half-baked place. So I think the green aspect of this is so key.
And some of the best examples of that is in London, which are famous for their green thumbs. But the London mews, MEWS, is really formed as a bunch of new urbanists who are trying to bring that back to the United States. Lou Oliver and Bill Allison in particular are working on plans that are co-opting that. I'm going to actually repeat what you told me in Philadelphia about these spaces. You pointed them out, particularly on commercial alleyways, which are also being activated, pointing out that with a little bit of greenery, these places can be paradise.
Yes.
But without greenery, they feel like a prison. I mean, these streams are almost that big when you're in these tight spaces. So the joy is often, many of these places in Philadelphia do have trees planted in the ground, but so many of them, again, a potted plant does wonders. And the spaces are so small, you can really activate them with just a pot. And you see that all over the London.
Absolutely.
Okay. Another questions, and obviously how do we deal with cars back here? And I think I've seen a lot of new urban stuff where the concept and the site plan's right, but by the time they get value engineered out, maybe they're in a suburban site that's just car loaded, you run the risk of them just the alley being just a sea of garage doors. But what are the tricks you've seen to hide cars in a way that don't ruin this compressed space?
Yeah, well, I would first want to say that, the car is comfortable going 25, 35 miles an hour. The pedestrian walks at like 3. So let's think about, is it the best use of our human scaled place to put the cars in the human scale place, And so thinking about Rosemary, where, the front street actually happens to be much narrower than that back street or, back of house where the cars are being parked. So thinking about that to start out with. So when thinking about transforming, let's say, an alley in South Bend, many of these alleys have almost no parking on them right now. Is there a way to keep minimal parking back there, not jumping to the conclusion that, hey, it's back of house, therefore parking should be there? But if you were to walk down, let's say, Circus Lane, right in Edinburgh, I showed images of that. On both ends of Circus Lane, there are these lovely garden walls, and I have a bunch of, they're 6 foot tall, maybe 6'6", and then they have maybe let's say a 10-foot space, right? So garden wall, pier, pillar, garden wall. And if you step in, you'll see maybe 6 to 8 parking spots within that. So I think there are ways of grouping small amounts of parking together. And we saw this in Philadelphia too, on that Irving and Quint Street, where you have 5 little interblock streets coming together, and just on one side, one end, there were, maybe a dozen parking spots, which the residents, split through their HOA or whatever kind of organization they had. So I think that there are ways to, one, allow the cars to go down the, in Philadelphia, the cartway is 6 foot or 6'6", and yet you still see cars and even trash trucks going down there. And then 2, being able to group these cars, in small groups on ends in little areas, do it tastefully behind masonry walls.
We've seen most great alleyways in the States do have garage doors on them, and there's some hybrid of, not every building does have them, but it's truly magical when you can isolate the cars away from it. And maybe that's Ross Chapin does this in a lot of the co-housing projects, where you just kind of isolate the cars to the side. It's not the prettiest part, but that preserves all of the housing and public space to not be compromised. And it seems like that's a tremendous opportunity for design and student research to do these, to design new alleyways that are fully removed from the car.
And if I could add Daybreak Mews by Opticos, right? And so they're an interesting spin on this. They basically took a block, well, they took 2 blocks, but we'll talk about one. They took a block and they just cut a new street, a pedestrian scaled street down the center, and then added alleys on the outside, in between the front street and their new pedestrian seat. So in effect, they went from front street, alley, pedestrian scaled street, alley, front street. And so that would be another way of skinning that. And that
in some ways, encourage you guys to look at the renderings there, because actually the pedestrian scale is sort of the one you see photographed all the time from Daybreak. But then there's really the utility access one, which kind of is a sea of garage doors. It's not as nearly as comfortable a place, and maybe it's intended not to be, but that it's separated, that there really is a place for cars and there really is a place for people. Separates them out, and they kind of get the, check both boxes without compromising either. And that's a different
right.
as well.
And I think done well, you're going to realize that the pedestrian street is actually a lot narrower than your car street where you're parking.
So Valerie Lane has a great question about experience in terms of sort of coordinating like-minded or differential property interests. So, I'm here in Durham, North Carolina, where we have, 20 different property owners share an alley. So your drawings almost imply some sort of not heavy-handed maker, but coordination, almost master planning.
Yeah.
And that's very chaotic. Has that really ever, one, is that possible? Are there examples of it? But what are you hoping to see as a tool to get alley people together to kind of create these special spaces?
Yeah. So if you were to download my book or buy it off of Amazon, I cover this in like the second half of it. And it's really thinking about, how do we make that leap? And I think that connecting of people and creating a shared vision is an enormous lift. And so I think that the first versions of this are going to be the Opticos Daybreak Mews versions. We're going to have a developer who can buy out an entire inner block, let's say, and then build on that. Or South Bend, let's say, where the 2 churches own all that property, they can develop those inner block spaces. But I would want to point to Philadelphia and say that if you look at the history of those buildings, and if you just walk down the street, you'll be able to tell, here are 5 buildings that were built at the same time, and then 2 buildings, and then 1 building, and then 3 buildings. So the incremental developers of the time, there was a shared sense of holding a street wall and being able to develop these beautiful streets without a master plan, right? None of those minor streets were master planned, and yet they were built and they exist. Many of them exist today. So that's actually my work right now, which is how do we write ADU guidelines for lots with alleys, for blocks, let's say, with alleys? How do we create ADU guidelines with subsidiarity at their heart, which would foster that shared vision between homeowners, so that we can throw out the existing zone and come up with a whole new set of parameters for new construction along alleys that will give people that vision, that impetus to invest. And I think the investment can be quite small. I think that's one thing that our existing interblock alleys can show us, that you can create a lovely space with garden walls. It doesn't have to be buildings on both sides of the street all the time. Hedges.
One of the questions too, I guess you see in Philadelphia, is where the front and the rear house could actually be sold separately. And this is probably because they predated modern zoning, which would almost entirely prohibit that. I know Eli Spevek out in Portland has some really good blog posts about how people are condoing those spaces, which is, there's a lot of reasons not to do that with some complexity. But in Philadelphia, are they separated very typically? Like, can you actually buy the two buildings separately?
So in Philadelphia, Philadelphia, they were never connected, right?
Okay.
I mean, there might be an extreme example in which case you had a building on a major street and a building on a minor street that were on the same lot, but they were being sold off and bought by incremental developers and then built upon, right? So there was never even a history of, and I think that's part of my point with the alleys in Philly. They were their own street, with their own lot frontages. That was a fee simple thing before those buildings were built. Now, if you were to go to the mews in England, that's a history in which those were all carriage houses of the front. By the time those were redeveloped, they were all being subdivided. So the mews in England, yes, every single mews, almost every single mews building is its own property, fee simple. In Philadelphia, they were never part of, or almost never part of the same lot as a primary house. And so that might be, I love the concept of the compound by Andreas. And I love, he talks about what's between my house and City Hall, right? And there's nothing, right? Like, where's the hierarchy of government come? But when in that compound, you have this relationship, these relationships that could start to be built through having the ADU, the two ADUs, the different people that are living, interacting with me through, their rental agreements or whatever. And so I love the thought of ADUs forming these minor streets, but I can also imagine that the most success could be found with the subdivision and selling off the lots adjacent to alleys.
So David Rabinowitz asked a question about the idea of really using these continuous alleys as actually new corridors for pedestrian and biking corridors. Obviously, these are very comfortable spaces for those modes of transit, but have you seen any examples of people actually stringing them together to create greenway corridors or sort of longer distance ways of getting around the city?
You definitely feel like that sometimes in Philly. Like, a lot of the streets are non-continuous, so it's just a break, a jog, and you get on to the next one. But sometimes they do string together, and you do start to get that feeling of urban oasis, moment of crossing Main Street, urban oasis. You get that in the Netherlands. Now, these are historic examples where you have the major and minor street weave. And so you could, you'll be on this 18, maybe even 16-foot wide, beautiful residential street. And then you'll walk across the 45-foot one, and there's the Market Street going that way. And then you're back on the residential street. And so there are definitely streets that I'm thinking about right now where that happens. I think somebody has shown me, some of the interblock stuff in Milwaukee. I think there are kind of moments maybe of that there. But I think that is going to be something that cities and towns across the country are going to start doing.
It's super interesting because especially in a lot of the cities that are, have limited wealth, and obviously bike and ped infrastructure is always sort of the redheaded stepchild. But, when we're always trying to find, greenway money is $1 million a mile, and you have to find a new corridor and eminent domain, this or that. A big belief structure of like bicycle boulevards and neighborhood greenways you see in Portland and Seattle. It's just like, just use the already existing infrastructure. Like, it's literally already paved. Like, all you got to do is sort of sign it or make clear that it's a path and develop it lightly, and it creates these corridors using what you already have. So
the expense of doing anything else and the bureaucratic hurdles are almost a non-starter, and that's why if you look at that history of urban form and you look at the continental grid, and it's like, okay, so we founded the country and then they came up with a framework for platting the entire rest of the country. But if you trace that back far enough, it's like, okay, then we got the alley, right? The alley made its way in there, and it was just meant as a service thing, but it happens to be human scaled. That is a hidden resource that we can capitalize on.
So Nancy Bruning had a great question of, and actually Lauren just put in the chat for whatever reason I can't post, but if you guys like this conversation, I had about an hour and a half one-on-one with Thomas on the Town Builders podcast. about when this book came out. So you can follow that link if you want to hear the more details of it. Nancy Bruning talked about, well, if these alleyways do not exist already, and we're not blessed to have this grid cut like a Chicago or Philadelphia might have, are you imagining that what's the best path to retrofit these? None of that's easy, but is this an eminent domain path and all that messiness, or is this like-minded property owners coming together and all agreeing to, hey, let's cut a path through here for mutual benefit?
I think it's going to be the latter. I think it's going to be the incremental developers. I think the incremental developers and some of the work that, say, like Matt Petty, Matt Hoffman, Jen Griffin are doing with pre-approved plans, that's going to be the future. And it's going to be recognizing, and at the CNU presentation we did together this past spring, we were looking at some of the most, attract the places that bring in tourists, right? These anchor tourist locations fit on tiny pieces of land, right? So I can create a sense of place on this. And Carlton Landing was an example too. If you were to simply buy 2 adjacent lots, you could do amazing things, right? So it doesn't take a whole lot of land. So I think let's forget about the eminent domain. The best interblock spaces, I would argue, or at least my approach, I'm sure there are many good approaches, would be to have a bottom-up approach. That's how the best interblock spaces were created. Buy a couple lots, work with the incremental developers, work with some of these pre-approved plans that John Anderson and other people are putting together, and recognize that an 18-foot wide street is the most photographed street in the United States.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting too, for any of the students or younger folks on here. I mean, we've talked about it's an incredible opportunity to kind of further your work and further some of the work of AARP. Like, retrofitting is messy and hard. Like, you really have to get kind of all property owners to agree, and that's its own challenge. But maybe there's 4 or 5 that agree where you can do sort of a dead end alley off of an existing street. And it's not that hard to bake hey, the city there's almost like a private public partnership that's in a mini form, where the city might pave the alley, maybe do utilities, maybe they come from the front in exchange for it's like a mini tip, the increase in tax values that would come from building 5 or 6 homes similar to what you've drawn. It's just a simple math equation where the city could say, oh gosh, yeah, we'll pay that, absolutely. It'll be a 3-year payback or 5 or 10 or whatever it is. Seems like that would be some obvious next phase research for somebody to take on.
Absolutely, and I think that's been the guiding vision of my work of the last 2 or 3 years, is looking that question earlier about how do we get over this hurdle of individual property owners that have no shared vision, right? The hurdle that we might maybe know more about our national politics than we do about our local politics. And we haven't seen good development in 50 years, very, very likely. So how do we actually create some kind of shared vision where the investment needed for something like this is significant and the barriers are excruciatingly high? So I would say, I'm looking at ways to simply redo the codes, right? Like if a municipality was willing to help out and put in the street light, put in the lovely street lights and paving, even better, like a little tip for that. But my goal and what I'm working on is a couple different frameworks that would allow citizens to approach municipalities and say, hey, this is our vision. These are the 4 things we need changed to make this vision a reality. And we're going to pass an ADU legislation for interblock development with these, 4 stipulations or whatever it would be.
Lauren gave us the 5-minute warning almost 5 minutes ago. I appreciate that most of the people on here are probably working folks who are taking a lunch. So I wanted to thank everybody. We can stick around and kind of answer some more of these questions. There's probably 30 of them still in the chat, Thomas, just so you know. But I've always found this stuff super interesting just because it's really a cutting edge part of new urbanism, that we all love alleys, but we don't really talk about them that much. And I love that in working with the Incremental Development Alliance, there's really this scale is one that almost anybody can operate at. You don't have to be a big developer to operate here. And it's at a scale where some personal stuff can be made. So super fascinating stuff. Encourage everybody to buy the book, which you can just look up on Amazon, The American Alley, because it's really well written and kind of covers these topics. So parting thoughts from you, Thomas?
Well, what you just said right there, I think opening up the door to democratizing in some sense the public realm. You know, I was just thinking, as you said that, I was thinking about Acorn Street and Beacon Hill, right? If I think about Beacon Hill as a place, sense of place, I'm thinking about the neighborhood. And if I'm on a street, that street, the character of that street, the sense of place of that street is determined by the length of the street very often, the intersections, you know, as it's very interesting as you grow that scale, right? If the street is 75 foot from building face to building face or 100 foot from building face, then the number of factors that play a role in creating a sense of place and the power, let's say, of that sense of place is determined at, you know, an X factor, many X factors of like how much investment would it need to create a Beacon Hill. But in Acorn Street, which you could argue, you know, that's the most photographed street, is at a fraction of that scale, of that capital, of, you know, the infrastructure needed. And yet, without them being competing or without even one really being a judgment on the other, you could argue that the sense of place of Acorn Street is as powerful in some ways as the neighborhood of Beacon Hill. And so I think recognizing that individuals have this possibility, the land has been locked, you know, we haven't been able to just cut new public realm into our cities. You know, that's been off limits for 100 years about. But if we could start opening up that door, which ARP's been doing with ADUs and really looking at, you know, some of the work of obviously the new urbanists and CNU, if we could start allowing that, I think the future, we would see such remarkable places.
That's great. Well, Lauren told us we could stick on for a couple minutes. We've still got 150 people on. I know some people will drop, but let me do a speed round with you. And thanks everybody for attending this. I really appreciate Rob and Lauren putting these on with CNU. I think it's one of the ways we can stay engaged while we're not in the conference. So let me, let's see here. We can spend another 10 minutes kind of flying through, but thanks everybody. A bunch of people asked about ADA requirements. What have you seen with ADUs and alley block development as it relates to ADA?
I mean, if you go down to ARP, like it gets addressed. I mean, obviously that's one of their key concerns, universal design. One of the interesting things I found in the Netherlands is that their interblock spaces are very often specifically designed around elderly and children. So you'll go from Main Street, you take a left, you're in a courtyard, it's elderly housing. You keep going, you take a right, it's the elementary school. And so they were very conscious of that, and you'll see the zero thresholds on almost every single one of their doors. In Philadelphia, we saw a mix of different things. Very often for privacy's sake, you'll see the 3 or 4 steps up. I think that there are many historic and new examples of the ADA accessible interblock space. I'm working on, I think, a really exciting one in Carlton Landing with Grant Humphreys, and it's going to be really the first God's house, the intentionally designed interblock courtyard with small houses that are going to be ADA accessible.
One of the questions from Daryl Bevick, I think I understand this question. He was talking about there are really great greenfield developments in Oklahoma, and particularly in both Carlton Landing and Wheeler. But what can older cities learn from these new developments with interblock development? Well,
I think everything we've been talking about so far, I think the biggest thing I would do is I would just show them comparison, like scale comparisons next to each other. You know, what did you find successful in Carlton Landing? Boom. Here's your block. Here's your existing alley. That thing that you found so successful in Carlton Landing fits inside your alley that this alley happens to not even be used or whatever. I did a charrette in Tulsa a number of years ago, and that was actually one of the first impetus for this thinking in this project for me, was walking down these alleys that had been completely abandoned. They were little war zones. There were trees, there were cars, there were fires. Like these were abandoned spaces that had not been deplatted, but recognized the opportunity. We're not talking about moving infrastructure from the alley to the outside of the street. It's simply recognizing that the human scale that we're hardwired for, that the most photographed streets in America are at that scale, those could be created along these abandoned alleyways.
What transect would you think alleyways fall into primarily?
I mean, it totally depends on how to, you know, when you say alley, you know, if it's a back of back of house, I think that it's really relating, our conventional alley here, where does that fit into the transect? Douglas Duani, I think, would critique the way that the transect is often used today, and I would agree with him. I would say one of the characteristics of interblock, and where I use the word transect shift, is that when you step into a block, you typically step down in transect. So if I'm walking along a city street in Edinburgh, Newtown, Edinburgh, and I turn and walk down the Mews, it takes me all of about 10 or 15 seconds to be completely in a village. So I went from city to village, right? In the Netherlands, very similar things. Now, I would argue that you could today be walking down, let's say, a typical residential block, walk into an alley, and depending on how you develop that, you might feel like you went up in transect, right? Like you might walk into, we were talking about ADUs, and I've been talking about residential interblock, but what about interblock commercial? What about what do they call it, ACU?
Yeah.
Accessory commercial?
Accessory commercial, there's a lot of text on both in Raleigh and Portland because this concept.
So some of the most successful interblock places I can think of, like walk through York, the Shambles, the market streets. Douglas would say the best market street is one where you're walking down the center and I can window shop both sides at the same time. Go to the Netherlands, like these market streets are like that, right? I can see, so I think we could take interblock spaces in both directions.
Super interesting. A great opportunity for somebody who draws, or again, a student exercise to actually expand that transect, recognizing some of the flaws with it, but actually showing the alleys behind the step down alley size behind, T5 and T4 or whatever would make for a fascinating drawing to kind of convey that concept. A question on design. What are some standards, perhaps form-based codes that could be put in for walls so that they are interestingly designed, not blank spaces or canvases for graffiti, or dangerous to pedestrians at night, as these spaces are smaller? What strategies do you see to address those issues?
Yeah, if you get the book, I have a couple pages on walls, and I would say you see repeating patterns, right? How are all of these, 100 minor streets or whatever? Almost all minor streets are a combination of buildings and walls. It's not all buildings, and very often you'll see a checkerboard where it's building fronts wall to preserve privacy. And you'll see very typical, almost all masonry walls, but you'll see hedges. And the last image I had was St. Michael's Alley, which is a historic alley in Charleston, but alley meaning residential street alley. But it's actually, that's probably how it was platted, but it's kind of a combination. Charleston's a really great place to look for precedent today for these alleys. There's only, maybe a half dozen of them, but it didn't have the industrial pressures of the East Coast cities. So it was agrarian. And so you never saw the kind of density concerns that Philadelphia and these other cities had. And so you end up having these beautiful, just a few of them, beautiful pedestrian scaled, 18-foot wide little lanes or alleys that are not at the density of Philadelphia. And so you'll see a couple buildings and then a hedge, a couple buildings, a masonry wall, maybe even a wood stockade fence or something like that. So I would say, look to what's working.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating again to see these in like sort of almost suburban and rural just design, because the concept can still work even though it's more spaced out.
One final thought on that though is that, the wall, like the intention of that is shaping space, right? If I have a 4-foot wall, my alley space is how my line of sight is contained. So know that whatever wall we're talking about, if I want the space of the minor street of this alley to be 18-foot wide, well, it's got to be above my eyes. So you'll often see these minor street walls to be 6 foot, 6'6". So
what's been the best way to broach alley development and interblock development with historic communities who may be reluctant to work within tight confines of historic district constraints?
I don't have the experience to really talk about it. I mean, I've done a little bit of that, trying to start these conversations. And I think really it's pointing out that it's in the historic places that, and around here, where I'm outside Philadelphia, that's where the minor streets exist. So you're showing this is part of our history, right? You're giving a presentation to a HARB or a planning commission. You're saying, this is what makes Westchester, Philadelphia. This is what makes gives the character and definition to our place. Like, this is what makes us so special. And it's very easy to go to a comprehensive plan and say, this is really at the heart of the comprehensive plan, continuing these traditions of development and the buildings that give the character that make our place special. And part of that are these alley streets, these alley buildings. And so legalizing, really pointing out the fact that the break in continuity was that we made them illegal at one point. You know, like, we were developing like this for a solid 200, 250 years. They became illegal. Let's legalize them again.
I'm a restoration contractor for most of my career here in Durham, and the other argument is that historic districts can and should tightly regulate the front, as they do in Savannah and Charleston. But the back, it is almost inherently more flexible and kind of an afterthought. And if you do something different or even weird, it doesn't threaten the front. So you have more of a blank canvas to be creative. And that's not to say some of your sort of cohesive design stuff that's in your book might still be desirable. But most alleys, including the one I live on, people kind of did their own thing, and it still forms a pretty great space. So, and it's in a historic district. So that is an argument that you're kind of allowing change, which is something most historic districts are sort of have a visceral reaction to. But it's change that relieves pressure on knockdowns and, you know, front of the house change that they're really worried about, and allows the neighborhood to evolve while keeping that original character. So that's at least some of the pitch.
That's a better answer, and I think also gets more to the heart of interblock development, and that it is its own little nested thing. And I don't need a form-based code or overhaul of my entire city. And what is appropriate for this block maybe is not appropriate for this block. I can develop, you know, the most photographed street in America right here, where they're using their alley for cars, and that's great. So I think your answer is better.
Somebody asked, is this concept applied downtown districts that have a lot of high rises? Can you do interblock development in such a form?
I've seen it in DC. And I'll go to Mark, if you think about like, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Market Square in Pittsburgh is a really interesting example. Now it's a historic place, but you have a feeling of interblock, and that the scale's drastically different when you step inside of there. And there's something really kind of exciting, I think, about stepping into this human scaled place, 3-4 story buildings, their traditional, you know, layout, and towering above them is, you know, like the glass skyscraper. You get the same kind of feeling in some places in Philadelphia too, which is kind of actually exciting and fun to have that contrast.
Yeah, for sure. Nancy Bruning has a great question about this. If I can't imagine this in a large city, except maybe repurposing parking lots that go through the whole block. And it's interesting because we contextualize, most of your work is really based upon a front back alley. You know, it's the simplest way to understand these, but really the Notre Dame example, the beautiful rendering that the students did, a lot of these are sort of on larger excess parcels, parking lots, underutilized green spaces. And I know in Durham, which we're hoping to get you down for, we're about to do a faith-based housing charrette where in the South, most churches have excess land. Not all of them are perfect for this, but it has nothing to do with an alley. It just has to do with, you can create a little village on,
that's right,
you know, a green or a parking lot. So what do you, where should people look for these opportunities to build these sort of human scale villages?
I would say the first thing to recognize is that you can create these places with almost no land. So if you were to go to Haarlem in the Netherlands and walk through their Hofje, which are their elderly housing interblock spaces, there are examples there which you would find unbelievable. Tiny little passage, you walk through, courtyard, stunningly beautiful garden, 4 houses around it, let's say on either side, or maybe it's 3 with like a brick wall along the back. And if you were to look at it on a plan, you know, pencil it out, you could fit those things all over your city, no matter which city you were based in. I mean, most of our American cities. So I think the scale can come way down. And you're right, there's no need for this to be an alley. I think an alley is kind of the lowest hanging fruit, but it's any place where you can create new public, semi-public space inside the block. How do you get those little homes around it? And that's what our demographics are asking for. That's what elderly housing, that's what they're asking for, that demographic. So there's a market demand.
Trade job is a great question, which I know needs further research and crowdsourcing information. But what sort of creative solutions have you seen for financing this type of development, a God house or small villages? There's plenty of interest in this, but the market's slow to react, and I suspect that financing is probably a headwind.
I think that's right, and I think that's why we're going to see big developments do it first. I mean, already I saw a stat come out of Portland, maybe last year, that said there were more ADU permits pulled than major primary homes. So that's an example where you're seeing a whole lot of ADUs being built, and those could be built in such a way that they turn their back on the alley. Portland doesn't have a whole lot of alleys, so let's just say that a city with alleys could see more ADU permits being pulled than primary dwellings, right? So that's a huge amount of investment that's already going to be going into these. If you have an alley, it's kind of an inner block building type. And so there's the opportunity to face that alley and create a shared vision with the other people along that alley, or to turn your back on it. So that's investment right there. Daybreak Mews is a good example. The developer, you can read about it online. The developer said he was nervous about the building type. He was nervous about development. And yet, they developed the entire block. It was the mews houses that sold much more quickly than the houses on the front streets. So I think it's a highly desirable product. In the book, I highlight other versions of this, either with new urbanist developers or just other developers of the last 25 years. The cottage court's a good example too. There's a demand for it. So I think incremental developers are probably going to be the first people that are going to find a home for these missing urban spatial types.
That's great. I think we can wrap up, but there's two of our Canadian friends, or people who are familiar at least with Canada, pointed out that Montreal and Toronto both have greenway corridors on contiguous alleyways, which is super cool, and I'd love to see more.
That's a great point, and at least Toronto has a lot of literature on it too, and so that's a great resource. I'm glad they brought that up. Yeah, they've been doing some really wonderful work with that in Canada.
Well, that's good. I don't know if Lauren or Rob want to chime in, but I thank everybody for coming and sticking around.
Thank you.
For the overtime. And we'll encourage people to, we have similar, this I'm sure will be posted. We have a similar conversation, which gets into more of the kind of technical side of his book through that podcast that was linked. Thanks, Lauren and Rob, for hosting these. They're really enjoyable. We appreciate it.
Yes.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you so much, Thomas and Aaron. And there will be a recording of the webinar available within 24 hours.
Good day,
Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Lauren.